The carriage came to a stop before Ashcombe Hall just as the last light of evening turned the stone walls to gold, and every window in the house seemed to hold its breath. For 2 years Duke Alaric Vane had been gone from England, and in that time the halls of Ashcombe had grown quiet with waiting. Servants lined the steps in their best dress. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, stood at the front with her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the carriage door as if she could will it open faster. No one in the county knew what to expect. Letters from the Duke had been few and short. He wrote that he was well. He wrote that he was returning. He did not write that he was bringing a wife. The carriage door opened and Alaric stepped down first. He looked older than his years, his face weathered by sun and travel, but his eyes were steady and calm, the eyes of a man who had made peace with something the rest of them did not yet understand. Then he turned and offered his hand into the dark of the carriage. A woman stepped down. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue, simple but well made, and a bonnet that framed a face of quiet, striking beauty. But it was not her face that caught every eye in that yard. It was her hands. She wore gloves, long pale gloves that reached past her wrists, the kind a lady might wear to a ball, not to step down from a dusty carriage after days on the road. Mrs. Aldridge dropped into a curtsy, and behind her the rest of the staff followed, but their eyes kept drifting to those gloves. "My wife," Alaric said, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet pride, "the Duchess of Ashcombe." The words fell into a silence so complete that a bird could be heard calling from the trees beyond the drive. No one had known. No banns had been read in any parish near Ashcombe. No invitation had gone out for a wedding breakfast. No notice printed in any paper the county received. The Duke of Ashcombe, heir to one of the oldest titles in England, had married a woman that not a single person present had ever seen or heard of before this moment. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Mrs. Aldridge managed, recovering herself. "And welcome to Ashcombe, Your Grace," she added, turning to the new Duchess with a bow of her head. "Thank you," the woman said. Her voice was soft, warm, touched with an accent that was hard to place, something not quite of any county in England. "I have heard so much about this house. I am glad to finally see it." "Marianne," Alaric said gently, "shall we go inside? The journey has been long enough." Marianne. That was the only peace anyone had, a single name offered like a small kindness, and even that felt like too little against the size of the mystery standing in gloves before them. As the couple climbed the front steps, a carriage came rattling up the drive behind them, faster than good manners allowed. It stopped hard, and a woman climbed out without waiting for a footman to assist her. Lady Constance Hale had never been a patient woman, and she had clearly heard the news of the Duke's return before the dust of his own carriage had settled. "Alaric," she called, moving toward the steps with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You did not think to send word ahead? I had to hear from my own coachman that you had returned, and married, no less." "Constance." Alaric's tone was even, careful. "This is my wife, Marianne." Lady Constance turned to study the new Duchess the way a merchant studies a horse before buying it. Her gaze moved from Marianne's face down to her gloved hands, and something sharp flickered behind her eyes. "How lovely," she said. "And where, may I ask, did you find her, Alaric? I do not recall any Wells family among the good houses of England." "Marianne's family is not from England," Alaric said. "We met abroad." "How romantic." Lady Constance's smile widened, but it was the smile of a woman already turning a puzzle over in her mind, looking for the loose thread that would unravel it. "And is there a reason, my dear, that you keep your gloves on indoors? It is rather warm this evening." Marianne's expression did not change, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides. "I find I have grown used to them," she said simply. "A habit from my travels." "How curious," Lady Constance murmured, and said no more, but the word curious hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. Alaric guided Marianne past his cousin and into the house, and the great doors of Ashcombe Hall closed behind them, but the silence they left behind in the yard was not the silence of relief. It was the silence of 100 questions with nowhere yet to go. Inside, the great hall of Ashcombe rose around Marianne in dark wood and old portraits, generations of vain dukes staring down from their frames as though weighing whether she belonged among them. She stopped for a moment, looking up at the nearest painting, a stern-faced man in a red coat. "My grandfather," Alaric said, following her gaze. "He would have liked you. He never had patience for people who cared more for gossip than for character." "I hope the rest of the house feels the same," Marianne said quietly. "Give them time," Alaric said, though something in his voice suggested he was not entirely certain of it himself. That night, After Marianne had gone up to rest from the journey, Alaric remained in his study with a glass of brandy untouched on the desk before him. Colonel Hugh Farrow, his oldest friend, and a man who had served beside him for years, found him there, staring into the fire. "You could have written to me," Hugh said, letting himself in without waiting for an invitation, as old friends do. "A letter. A single line. 'Alaric, I have married.' Instead, I hear it from a stable boy who heard it from your coachman." "I did not know how to write it," Alaric admitted. There was no simple way to explain her, Hugh, not in a letter. "Try explaining it to me now, then." Hugh took the chair across from him, studying his friend's tired face. "Who is she? Truly?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment. "She is the finest person I have ever known," he said finally. "That is the truth I can give you tonight. The rest will have to wait." "The gloves," Hugh said. Everyone in that yard was thinking it, even if no one but Constance had the nerve to ask outright. "What is she hiding, Alaric?" "Nothing that should matter to anyone," Alaric said. And there was an edge in his voice now, sharp enough that Hugh did not press further, though the question remained plainly unanswered. Upstairs, in the room that had once belonged to Alaric's mother and was now hers, Marianne stood before the tall mirror and slowly drew off her gloves. Her hands, freed from the fabric, were pale in the candlelight. She turned them over, studying them the way a person studies an old wound to see if it has healed. For a long moment she simply looked, her face unreadable, before she reached for the gloves again and pulled them back on, even here, even alone, even with the door locked and no one to see. She sat by the window and looked out over the dark grounds of Ashcombe, the moon rising over hills she did not yet know, in a country that was not yet home, married to a man she loved more than her own safety, carrying a truth she had promised to keep hidden until the day it could no longer be hidden at all. Somewhere below, in the corridors of the great house, whispers had already begun among the staff. Quiet words passed from one candle to the next about the strange new Duchess and her gloves that never came off. By morning, those whispers would reach the village. By the week's end, they would reach every drawing room in the county. And in her own house not 3 miles distant, Lady Constance Hale sat awake long past midnight, turning the evening over in her mind, already certain of one thing. Whatever the Duchess of Ashcombe was hiding beneath those gloves, Constance intended to be the one who uncovered it. The candle beside her burned low, and still she did not sleep, already composing in her mind the first quiet questions she would begin asking around the county, questions dressed as friendly concern but sharpened, underneath, like the edge of a blade. Outside, the wind moved through the old oaks of Ashcombe, and the house that had waited 2 years for its duke to return, now waited for something else entirely, though no one within its walls could yet say what that something would turn out to be. Early the next morning, before most of the household had risen, Marianne walked alone through the garden behind the hall. Frost still clung to the grass, and her breath rose in small clouds as she moved along the gravel path between rows of sleeping roses. She had not slept well. The bed was soft, the room was fine, but everything around her was still strange, and strangeness, she had learned, kept a person from resting easily. She paused beside a stone bench and looked back at the great house rising behind her, its many windows catching the pale morning light. It was larger than anything she had known before, grander than she had imagined even after Alaric's careful descriptions during their long journey home. She wondered, not for the first time, whether she would ever feel as though she belonged inside those walls. A sound of footsteps on the gravel made her turn. It was not Alaric, but an older woman she had not yet met, dressed plainly, carrying a basket of cut flowers. "Forgive me, Your Grace," the woman said, dropping into a quick curtsy. "I did not know anyone else would be about so early. I am Nora. I tend the gardens here." "Please, do not let me disturb your work," Marianne said, offering a small smile. "The garden is lovely, even in the cold." Nora studied her for a moment, curiosity plain on her open face, though she was too well-mannered to ask the question that Marianne could see forming behind her eyes. "The roses will be beautiful again come spring, Your Grace. His late Grace, the old Duke, planted half of them himself, many years back. I should like to hear more about him sometime," Marianne said. "Alaric speaks of him with such fondness." "He was a good man," Nora said simply, then hesitated, glancing briefly at Marianne's gloved hands before catching herself and looking away. "I ought to get on, Your Grace. Forgive me again for disturbing your morning." Marianne watched her go, understanding well enough what had passed unspoken between them. It would not be the last such moment, she knew. It would happen again and again, in kitchens and drawing rooms and church pews, small glances toward her hands, quickly hidden, never quite explained. She drew her shawl tighter and continued along the path, past a low wall where ivy had begun to climb, toward the edge of the garden where the land opened onto rolling fields beyond. England was beautiful, she had to admit, even in the gray hush of early morning, even to a woman who had crossed so great a distance to reach it, carrying with her a secret far heavier than any suitcase. By the time she returned to the house, the kitchens had come alive with the clatter of pots and the low murmur of servants at their morning work. She caught snatches of conversation as she passed the corridor near the kitchen door, voices dropping the moment they noticed her shadow, but not quite fast enough. Never seen her hands bare, not once, not even at the table. Mrs. Aldridge says she wore them straight through supper last night, gloves and all if you can credit it. The voices stopped entirely when Marianne appeared in the doorway. Two young maids straightened at once, faces reddening, curtsying low. "Good morning," Marianne said evenly, giving no sign that she had heard anything at all. "I hope I am not too early for breakfast." "Not at all, Your Grace," one of the maids stammered. "Right this way." Marianne followed her toward the breakfast room, aware of the eyes that followed her down every corridor of the great house, aware that beneath the polite bows and careful smiles, the questions were already spreading like water finding every crack in old stone. She had known, when she agreed to come to England, that this would happen. She had simply not expected it to begin quite so soon, on her very first morning as Duchess of Ashcombe. At the breakfast table, Alaric was already seated, a newspaper folded beside his plate, untouched. He rose the moment she entered, pulling out her chair himself before any footman could reach it. "You slept well, I hope," he said, though the look on her face told him otherwise before she had spoken a word. "Well enough," Marianne said, taking her seat. "The house is beautiful, Alaric. I only wish I did not feel quite so much like a stranger walking through it." "That will pass," he said, reaching across the table to cover her gloved hand with his own. "Give it time. Give them time. They will come to know you as I know you, and none of this will matter." Marianne looked down at his hand resting over hers, and for a moment, in the quiet of that bright breakfast room, she allowed herself to believe him. But even as she did, she could still hear, faintly, the echo of whispered voices drifting through the corridors of Ashcombe Hall, voices that would not be silenced simply because she wished them to be, voices that had already begun asking the one question she was not yet ready to answer. Within a week, the name of the new Duchess of Ashcombe had traveled far beyond the borders of the estate, carried on the tongues of coachmen, maids, and shopkeepers until it reached every parlor of consequence in the county. Marianne felt the change the moment she stepped into the village church that first Sunday. Heads turned as she walked the aisle beside Alaric, conversations dropped to murmurs, fans lifted to cover mouths that were not quite whispering low enough. She kept her chin level and her back straight, exactly as her mother had taught her long ago, in a place far from these cold English pews. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. After the service, on the church steps, a cluster of local ladies gathered around her with the practiced warmth of women eager to be the first to carry fresh gossip home. Mrs. Fenwick, the vicar's wife, led the group, her smile bright and her eyes sharp. "Your Grace, we are so pleased to finally make your acquaintance," Mrs. Fenwick said. "You must tell us everything. Where did you and His Grace meet? It is the talk of 3 counties, I am sure." "We met abroad," Marianne said, the same answer she had given a dozen times already. "It is not a very interesting story, I am afraid." "Oh, but every love story is interesting," said another woman, younger, with a sly glance toward Marianne's gloved hands resting on her reticule. "Especially one kept so very secret from all of us. Tell me, Your Grace, do you find our English weather much colder than what you are accustomed to? You do keep yourself so well covered." The question was wrapped in politeness, but Marianne heard the true shape of it clearly enough. "The weather takes some adjustment," she answered simply, "as does a great deal else." Alaric appeared at her side before the questions could sharpen further, offering his arm with a smile that was warm but final. "Forgive us, ladies, but we are promised elsewhere this afternoon." As they walked to the carriage, Marianne felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her back, and she understood, with a clarity that settled cold in her chest, that this would not fade with time as Alaric had promised. If anything, it was only beginning. That evening, Lady Constance called at Ashcombe Hall uninvited, as had become her habit since the couple's return. She found Alaric alone in the drawing room, Marianne having retired early with a headache that was not entirely a lie. "You must see how this looks, Alaric," Constance said, settling into a chair without waiting to be asked. "A wife no one has heard of, a marriage no one witnessed, and now a duchess who will not remove her gloves even to take tea. People are beginning to say the strangest things. Let them say what they like," Alaric said. "It has never troubled me before." It troubles you now, whether you admit it or not, Constance pressed. I heard Squire Denby's wife say only yesterday that perhaps the girl is not truly your wife at all, that perhaps this marriage was arranged so quickly, so quietly, because there was some reason it could not withstand proper scrutiny. Do you understand what that would mean, Alaric? For the title? For the succession? The marriage is entirely legitimate, Alaric said, his voice hardening. I will not have it questioned, Constance, least of all by you. I only wish to protect the family name, Constance said, folding her hands with an expression of wounded innocence. As you know, I have always cared deeply for Ashcombe's standing. I would hate to see it damaged by rumors that a few honest answers could put to rest. Then let the rumors run their course, Alaric said. They will find nothing, because there is nothing to find. Constance rose to leave, but at the door she paused and looked back at him with an expression he could not quite read. I do hope you are right, cousin, for your sake and for hers. After she had gone, Alaric remained standing by the cold hearth for a long while, turning her words over. He did not like the certainty in her voice, the sense that she was not merely gossiping but building towards something, gathering pieces of a puzzle she intended eventually to complete. Upstairs, Marianne had not truly been asleep. She had heard enough of the conversation drifting up through the old floorboards to know its shape, if not every word. She sat by the window in the dark, her gloved hands folded in her lap, thinking of the promise she had made before ever setting foot on English soil, a promise that had seemed simple enough to keep when she made it, and now felt like a stone she carried everywhere she walked. The following days brought no relief. At the market in the village, she noticed how conversations stilled when she passed, how children were pulled a little closer by their mothers, how even the baker, usually a cheerful man, grew stiff and formal in her presence, his eyes flicking again and again to her gloved hands as he wrapped her bread. At a small dinner hosted by a neighboring family, the Ashfords, Marianne endured an evening of careful, circling questions disguised as polite conversation. What had her family done before her marriage? Where exactly abroad had she and the Duke met? Whether she found English society very different from what she had known. She answered each question with grace, giving away nothing, but she could feel Alaric watching her from across the table, his jaw tight, his patience visibly fraying with every question aimed at his wife like a small, precise blade. It was on the carriage ride home from the Ashfords' dinner that the first true crack appeared between them, small but unmistakable. You must let me help you, Alaric said quietly, once they were alone in the darkened carriage, the countryside sliding past the windows unseen. I cannot keep defending a wall I am not permitted to see over, Marianne. Tell me what you fear, and let me carry some of this with you. It is not fear, Marianne said, though her voice wavered slightly on the word. It is a promise, Alaric, one I made before I ever knew you would become my husband. I cannot break it simply because it has grown inconvenient. A promise to whom? Alaric asked. You have never told me. Not truly. Marianne turned to look out the window, her reflection faint and pale against the dark glass. Please, she said softly, not yet. I will tell you everything, I promise you that too. But not yet, and not because I do not trust you. Alaric studied her profile for a long moment, torn between the urge to press further and the deeper knowledge, built over months of knowing her, that pushing too hard would only close the door further. He reached over and took her gloved hand in his instead, saying nothing more, letting the silence between them carry what words could not. But silence, however gentle, could not slow what was already moving through the county like a fire finding dry grass. 2 days later, at a small gathering at the home of Lady Pemberton, Marianne overheard, quite by accident, a conversation not meant for her ears, spoken by 2 women near an open window she happened to be passing. My husband says the old Duke would never have approved of such secrecy, marrying a woman none of us know, from a family none of us have heard of. And the gloves, always the gloves. What decent woman hides herself so completely? I have half a mind to believe Lady Constance is right to ask questions. Marianne stopped walking, her hand tightening on the doorframe beside her. She had known the whispers existed. She had not expected to hear, so plainly, that Lady Constance's name was already attached to them, already shaping them, already turning simple curiosity into something with sharper edges. She composed herself before entering the room, greeting Lady Pemberton with perfect calm, giving no sign of what she had overheard. But that night, back at Ashcombe, she stood again before her mirror, gloves removed, staring at her own bare hands in the candlelight for far longer than she had allowed herself before. She thought of home, of the promise she had made, of the man sleeping in the next room who deserved better than half-truths. and of the growing certainty that whatever storm was gathering around her would not be turned aside by silence alone, no matter how carefully she guarded it. Downstairs in his study, Alaric sat awake even later than usual, a letter half-written before him, addressed to a contact abroad who might, if anyone could, help him understand what his wife would not yet say. He set down his pen without finishing it, uncertain whether seeking answers behind her back was an act of love, or a betrayal of the very trust he had asked her to give him. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the old windows of Ashcombe Hall, and somewhere beyond the dark fields, in her own well-lit house, Lady Constance sat writing letters of her own, letters that would travel further than anyone at Ashcombe yet suspected, carrying questions that were about to find answers neither she nor anyone else in the county was prepared for. The next morning brought a visitor Marianne had not expected. Hugh Farrow arrived at Ashcombe just after breakfast, asking not for Alaric, who had ridden out early to see to matters on the estate, but for the Duchess herself. Marianne received him in the small sitting room, uncertain what to make of the request. Hugh was polite, even warm, but there was a directness in his manner that told her at once he had not come merely to pay a social call. "Your Grace," he said, once the door had closed and they were alone, "I hope you will forgive me for speaking plainly. I have known Alaric since we were boys. I have never seen him as happy as he has been since his return, nor as troubled as he has been these past days, watching you endure what the county has been saying. He should not trouble himself on my account," Marianne said carefully. "I am accustomed to managing my own difficulties." "That may be so," Hugh said, "but he is my closest friend, and I find I cannot simply stand by and watch him suffer for something he does not fully understand himself. I do not ask you to tell me your secrets, Your Grace. I only ask whether there is anything I might do to help ease this burden, for his sake if not your own." Marianne studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer. There was no cunning in his face, no hidden angle the way there had been in every conversation she'd had with Lady Constance, only genuine concern, plainly offered. "There is one thing," she said slowly. "Lady Constance, I do not know her well enough to understand what drives her, but I sense she is not merely curious. She seems determined." Hugh's expression darkened slightly. "Constance has always resented her place in this family," he said. "She is Alaric's cousin, several times removed, but close enough in blood that before his marriage, her own son stood third in line to inherit Ashcombe, after Alaric and any children he might one day have. Your marriage, and any child born of it, moves her son further from the title than she would like." The words settled over Marianne like cold water. "Then her interest in me is not curiosity at all," she said quietly. "It is calculation." "I fear it may be both," Hugh admitted, "but you should know the shape of what you are facing, Your Grace. Constance does not simply gossip. She builds cases, slowly, patiently, the way a solicitor builds an argument for court. If she has decided there is something to find beneath those gloves of yours, she will not rest until she has found it, or convinced enough of the county that she has." Marianne rose and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds where frost still silvered the grass despite the climbing sun. "Thank you for telling me this," she said. "I would rather know the size of the danger than continue guessing at shadows." "Then let me offer one more thing," Hugh said, rising as well. "Whatever it is you are protecting, Your Grace, know that you have more allies in this house than perhaps you realize. Alaric would walk through fire for you. I have seen him do harder things for lesser causes. And for whatever small measure it is worth, you have my loyalty as well, freely given, no questions attached, unless you should ever wish to offer answers." Marianne turned back to him, something easing slightly in her guarded expression. "That is worth a great deal more than you might think, Colonel Farrow." "Hugh, please," he said, with the first real smile she had seen from him. "Any friend of Alaric's insists upon it." After he had gone, Marianne remained by the window a long while, turning his words over. She had come to England prepared to face suspicion, even hostility, but she had not expected to find unexpected kindness in the midst of it, nor had she expected to learn so plainly that Lady Constance's campaign against her was rooted in something far more concrete than idle curiosity. A title, an inheritance, a son who stood to lose his place in the world's eyes if Marianne's marriage produced an heir before Constance could unseat her. It changed nothing about the promise she still held close, the secret she was not yet ready to release. But it changed everything about how she understood the danger circling her, and by the time Alaric returned from the estate that afternoon, mud still on his boots and color high in his cheeks from the ride, Marianne met him at the door with a question of her own. "Tell me about Constance's son," she said, before he had even removed his coat. "Tell me everything." Alaric paused, studying her face, and something in her expression told him this was not idle curiosity either. "What has happened?" he asked. "What has she done?" "Nothing yet," Marianne said. "But I begin to understand, I think, exactly what she intends to do, and why." 2 years earlier, on a ship bound for the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, Alaric Vane had not expected his life to change at all. He had left England to escape it. For a time, the weight of a title he had not yet grown into, the memory of a father recently buried, the endless expectation pressing on him from every side. He wanted distance, he wanted silence. He did not want anything resembling love. The storm that struck the ship 3 days into open water gave him something else entirely. Waves higher than the deck rails crashed over the bow. Men shouted orders that the wind tore apart before they could be heard. Alaric had gone above to help secure the rigging, more out of restlessness than duty, when a wave took the footing from beneath him and sent him sliding across the deck toward the open rail. A hand caught his arm, small, strong, gripping with a determination that should not have matched its size. He looked up into the face of a young woman he had noticed once or twice below decks, traveling, he had assumed, with her family. She was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, but her grip did not loosen even as the ship rolled beneath them both. "Hold to the rope," she shouted over the wind, guiding his hand to a length of rigging lashed along the deck. "Do not let go until I tell you." Together they made their way, hand over hand, back toward the cabin door, the storm screaming around them the entire way. It was only once they were below, soaked and breathless in the narrow corridor, that Alaric properly saw her face for the first time, lit by a swinging lantern. "You saved my life," he said, still catching his breath. "You would have done the same," she said simply, "for anyone." Then she smiled, small and tired but real, and added, "Marianne Wells." "Alaric Vane," he answered, offering his hand. She took it without hesitation, her grip still strong from hauling him across a heaving deck, and something in that simple handshake, warm despite the cold seawater dripping from both their sleeves, settled into Alaric's chest and did not leave him for the remainder of the voyage. Over the following weeks, as the ship made its slow way toward warmer waters, Alaric found reasons to seek her out. She was traveling, he learned, to visit distant family, though she spoke of her circumstances with a carefulness that told him there was more beneath her words than she offered freely. She was clever in a way that surprised him, well-read, quick with an argument, unafraid to challenge his opinions on subjects most young women were taught to nod politely through. She was also, he began to notice, careful about her hands in a way that seemed unusual, even for a woman of modest means traveling among strangers. She wore gloves often, even in the warm evenings on deck, though he thought little of it at first, assuming it simply a habit of hers, or perhaps sensitivity to sun. It was in the port city of Alexandria, where the ship stopped for repairs and both passengers found themselves with several unplanned days ashore, that Alaric began to understand there was a deeper story behind Marianne Wells than she had yet shared. They had wandered together through the crowded market streets, the air thick with unfamiliar spices and the calls of merchants in half a dozen languages, when a group of local boys, playing some rough game, knocked hard into Marianne's side. Her glove, loosened by the impact, slipped partway from her hand before she could catch it. Alaric saw, for just a moment, before she pulled the glove firmly back into place, a mark on the back of her hand, pale and old, shaped like nothing he had seen before, half hidden beneath her sleeve. "Marianne," he said quietly, once the boys had run off and the street had settled again. "What was that?" "It is nothing," she said, tugging the glove firmly into place. "An old mark. Nothing worth discussing." It did not look like nothing. She turned to face him fully then, her expression suddenly serious in a way he had not seen from her before. "Alaric, there are things about my family, my past, that I am not free to share, not yet, and perhaps not for a long while yet. I would ask that you trust me, if you are able, without asking me to explain what I cannot explain." He studied her for a long moment, weighing the request against his own growing feelings that had crept up on him slowly across the weeks of the voyage, until he could no longer pretend they were merely friendly interest. "I trust you," he said finally, and found, to his own surprise, that he meant it completely. From that day forward he never asked again about the mark on her hand, though he noticed, in the months that followed, how carefully she guarded it, how rarely her hands were ever bare, even in the heat of the southern sun, even when every other woman around her had long since abandoned gloves for comfort. Their journey took them further than either had originally planned. What began as separate travels became, gradually and then all at once, a shared path. Alaric found excuses to delay his return to England. Marianne, whose original purpose in traveling grew vaguer with each conversation, seemed equally content to let the months stretch onward. It was in a small coastal town months later, watching the sun set over water the color of copper, that Alaric asked her to marry him. "You do not know everything about me," Marianne said, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears even as she said it. "There are things I still cannot tell you, perhaps things you would rather know before making such a promise." "I know the things that matter," Alaric said. "I know you pulled me from the edge of a ship in a storm, without a moment's hesitation. I know you have made me laugh more in these months than in the 2 years before them combined. I know that when I imagine my life going forward, in every version of it, you are there. The rest, Marianne, I am content to learn in time, whenever you are ready to give it." She had wept then, openly, and said yes, and the wedding that followed was small, quiet, held in a chapel in a foreign port with only a handful of witnesses, none of whom would ever cross paths with the society of Ashcombe, or hear the whispers that would one day follow the new Duchess home. But before the small ceremony, in the quiet hours before dawn, Marianne had asked him for one promise in return for her own. "When we return to England," she said, "I must keep my hands covered, always. In every room, before every guest, no matter what is said or thought of me. I cannot yet explain why, but I need you to trust that the reason is real, and that the day will come when I can finally show you, and everyone else, exactly what I have been protecting." "I promise," Alaric had said, without hesitation, sealing it with the same steady certainty that had carried him through the storm at sea and every uncertain mile since. "Whatever you need, Marianne, however long it takes." He had not fully understood, in that quiet moment before dawn, exactly how heavy that promise would become once they returned to England, how many eyes would watch, how many questions would be asked, how deeply a woman's covered hands could unsettle an entire county, convinced that anything hidden must also be shameful. Back in the present, in his study at Ashcombe, Alaric found himself turning these memories over again as he sat across from Marianne, the fire burning low between them, her question about Lady Constance's son still hanging in the air. "Her son is called Edmund," Alaric said slowly, returning his attention to the present. "A pleasant enough young man, though I have always sensed his mother's ambitions weigh more heavily on him than his own. Before I married, he stood third in line for the title, after myself and, eventually, any children I might have. It was always a distant possibility, but Constance has never been a woman to ignore even distant possibilities." "And now," Marianne said, "with our marriage, and any child we might have, his path to the title grows further still." "Yes," Alaric admitted, "though I confess I had not thought much on it until Hugh raised it with you today. I have never believed Constance capable of true harm, only of gossip, of small cruelties dressed as concern. But I begin to wonder if I have underestimated her." "Hugh believes she builds her arguments the way a solicitor builds a case," Marianne said, slowly, patiently. "I think we would be wise to take that seriously, Alaric, rather than dismiss it as mere family friction." Alaric reached across the space between their chairs and took her gloved hand in his, turning it gently over, studying the fabric that covered what he had glimpsed only once, years ago, on a crowded street in Alexandria, and had never seen again since. "Whatever she is building toward," he said quietly, "I will not let it touch you. I made you a promise once, on a beach on the other side of the world, and I intend to keep it, whatever it costs me here." Marianne squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words for a loyalty that had never once wavered, even as the pressure around them continued to build with every passing day, every whispered conversation, every careful question dressed as polite curiosity. Outside, evening had settled fully over Ashcombe, and somewhere across the dark fields, Lady Constance's letters were already moving through the world, carried by riders toward distant addresses, seeking answers to questions that would soon arrive at Ashcombe's door whether anyone there was ready for them or not. Neither Alaric nor Marianne yet knew how close that reckoning had already come, nor how little time remained before the quiet promise made on a foreign shore would be tested before the entire assembled society of the county, in a room bright with candlelight and sharp with judgment, where gloves alone would no longer be enough to keep the truth hidden. At that very hour, in the study of her own modest but well-appointed house, Lady Constance sat with her son Edmund across the desk from her, a stack of letters between them. "You worry too much over this, Mother," Edmund said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was a mild young man, more interested in horses and quiet evenings than in titles or schemes, and he had inherited none of his mother's hunger for advancement. Alaric has always been fair to us. Whatever this Marianne is hiding, it is likely nothing more than shyness, or some old injury she is embarrassed to show. You are naive, Edmund, and it will cost you dearly one day if you do not learn otherwise, Constance said sharply. A woman does not marry a duke in secret, in a foreign port, with no family present and no proper record sent home, unless there is something she desperately needs to keep concealed. I intend to learn what that is, for your sake if not mine. And if there is nothing to find? Edmund asked. What then, mother? You will have made enemies of the duke and his new duchess for nothing. Constance's expression did not soften. There is always something to find, Edmund, if one looks carefully enough. I have written to a solicitor in London, one with connections to shipping records and church registries across the Mediterranean ports. If this marriage was conducted improperly, if there is any question at all regarding its legality under English law, I intend to know of it before the rest of the county does. Edmund shifted uncomfortably in his chair. And if the marriage is entirely proper, if she is simply a private woman with an old scar she does not wish strangers to see, then we shall have lost nothing but a little time and a few letters, Constance said. But I do not believe it will come to that, Edmund. I have watched people my whole life. I have learned to read what lies beneath their careful faces. That woman is hiding something far larger than a scar, and I intend to be standing there, in full view of the county, when it is finally revealed. She rose from her desk and crossed to the window, looking out toward the dark shape of Ashcombe Hall visible in the distance across the fields, its windows lit faintly against the night. Your grandfather built our family standing through patience and careful attention to opportunity, she said, more to herself than to her son. I do not intend to let a stranger from some foreign port undo generations of careful positioning, simply because Alaric fell in love with a pretty face and a pair of gloves. Edmund said nothing further, recognizing, as he always did, the futility of arguing with his mother, once her mind had settled on a course. He gathered the letters from the desk and excused himself, leaving Constance alone with her thoughts and the dark window and the distant lights of Ashcombe Hall glowing faintly against the night sky, a puzzle she was determined to solve no matter the cost to anyone standing in her way. Days passed, and the replies to Constance's letters began arriving one by one, carried by riders from London and further afield. Most contained little of use, polite acknowledgments from solicitors and clerks promising to search records that might take weeks or months to properly review. But one letter, arriving nearly a fortnight after her first inquiries, caught her attention in a way the others had not. It came from a contact in the shipping offices of a Mediterranean port, a man who owed Constance's late husband a favor from years before, and had proven willing to make inquiries on her behalf. The letter was brief, careful in its wording, but it contained one detail that made Constance sit forward sharply at her desk. The passenger manifest for the vessel on which Alaric Vane had traveled home, the letter noted, listed a Marianne Wells among its passengers, traveling not with family, as Alaric had claimed, but entirely alone. Her point of origin recorded not as any English or European city, but as a place the clerk had never encountered before in his years of maritime work, a name that appeared nowhere on any standard map of the region. Constance read the passage 3 times, turning the strange, unfamiliar name over in her mind, tasting its unfamiliar syllables, feeling the shape of a mystery she had not expected but which now seemed, suddenly, far larger and far stranger than she had first imagined. She folded the letter carefully and locked it in the drawer of her desk, already composing in her mind the next questions she would need answered, already sensing that whatever truth lay beneath Marianne's gloves was not the small, ordinary secret of a hidden scar or humble birth that she had first assumed, but something else entirely, something that might prove far more useful to her purposes than she had dared to hope when she first began asking her careful, quiet questions around the county. For the first time since the Duke's return, Lady Constance allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, the smile of a hunter who has finally, after long patience, caught the scent of something worth pursuing all the way to the end. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, addressed in Lady Pemberton's careful hand, requesting the pleasure of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe's company at a gathering to celebrate the coming spring season. Marianne had attended a dozen such gatherings since her arrival, each one a small trial of politeness and careful deflection, but something about this particular evening would prove different from all the rest, though nothing in the invitation itself gave any hint of what was coming. The Pemberton house was already crowded when their carriage arrived, candlelight spilling from every window, the sound of music and conversation drifting out into the cool evening air. Marianne took Alaric's arm at the entrance, drawing a steadying breath before stepping into the bright, crowded room beyond. The evening began well enough. Marianne danced with Alaric, exchanged pleasantries with several of the kinder ladies of the county, and even found herself laughing genuinely at something Hugh Farrow said as he passed with a glass of punch in hand. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax, if only slightly, into the rhythm of the evening. It was during the second half of the gathering, as guests moved between the ballroom and the adjoining refreshment room, that the trouble began. A young woman Marianne had met only briefly, a cousin of the Pembertons visiting from London, approached her near the refreshment table with a bright, overly familiar smile. "Your Grace, I have heard the most fascinating things about you," the woman said. "Is it true you wear your gloves even to bed? My maid heard as much from one of your own housemaids." "I could not say what servants gossip about below stairs," Marianne answered evenly, though a flicker of tiredness crossed her face at the familiar shape of the question, worn thin now from repetition. "How mysterious you are," the woman pressed, stepping closer, her smile sharpening at the edges. "I do wonder what could possibly be worth hiding so completely. A scar, perhaps, or something else entirely." And before Marianne could step back, before Alaric, several feet away in conversation with another guest, could see what was happening, the woman reached out and closed her fingers around the edge of Marianne's glove, tugging sharply. The room seemed to tilt around Marianne in that instant. She wrenched her hand back hard, faster than the woman had expected, the glove staying in place but slipping badly at the wrist, and for one terrible suspended moment she thought it would come away entirely, right there, in the middle of a crowded ballroom, before she was ready, before anyone had earned the right to see what lay beneath. "How dare you," Marianne said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the surrounding chatter, drawing several heads to turn toward them. The young woman's face flushed, realizing too late what she had done, but the damage had already spread outward through the room like ripples on water. Conversations stopped, faces turned, and into the sudden hush, Alaric arrived at his wife's side, his expression darker than Marianne had ever seen it. "What has happened here?" he demanded, his eyes moving from Marianne's shaken face to the young woman's guilty one, and back again. "I meant no true harm, Your Grace," the woman stammered. "Only a jest, a small curiosity, nothing more." "You laid hands on my wife," Alaric said, his voice carrying now across the entire room, silencing every conversation still continuing at its edges. "In a public gathering, without her consent, attempting to force from her something she has chosen, for her own reasons, to keep private. I would remind everyone present that my wife's person is not a curiosity to be satisfied by whoever grows impatient enough to reach for it." The room fell utterly silent. Even the musicians in the corner let their instruments fall quiet, sensing the shift in the air. Lady Pemberton hurried forward, mortified, offering apologies on behalf of her guest, but the moment had already burned itself into the memory of everyone present, a story that would travel through the county faster than any of the softer whispers that had come before it. Marianne, still trembling slightly though she fought to hide it, straightened her glove with careful, deliberate movements, refusing to let her hands shake visibly before the watching room. "Thank you, Alaric," she said quietly, "but I think, perhaps, we should return home." They left shortly after, the carriage ride home passing in near total silence, both of them turning the evening over in their separate thoughts. It was only once they had reached the privacy of their own rooms at Ashcombe that Alaric finally spoke what had been building in him since the moment he saw the woman's hand close around his wife's glove. "This cannot continue," he said, pacing before the fire, while Marianne sat quietly in a chair near the window. "I watched a stranger try to strip away something you have guarded with your whole heart, in front of half the county, and I could do nothing but shout after the fact. I will not stand by while this happens again, Marianne. I need you to tell me the truth, all of it, so that I might actually protect you rather than merely defend you after the harm is already done." Marianne looked up at him, and for the first time since their return to England, something in her resolve seemed to waver visibly. "You do not understand what you are asking," she said softly. "It is not only my safety at stake in this, Alaric. There are others, far from here, who might be endangered if certain truths reach the wrong ears too soon." "Then let me help you decide when the time is right," Alaric said, kneeling before her chair, taking her gloved hands gently in his. "Not strangers reaching for you in ballrooms, not Constance building her cases in secret, not gossip deciding the moment for you. Let it be your choice, made with someone who loves you enough to guard it as carefully as you have." Marianne studied his face for a long, quiet moment, the fire casting warm light across features she had come to know as well as her own. "Soon," she said finally. "I promise you, Alaric, soon." But there is a reason I have waited this long, and I need you to trust that reason a little longer yet." He nodded, though the frustration had not entirely left his eyes, and pressed a gentle kiss to her gloved knuckles before rising. "Then I will trust you," he said. "But I fear we are running out of time to choose that moment ourselves. After tonight, Constance and half the county will not rest until the truth is dragged into the light one way or another, whether we are ready for it or not." He was, though he did not yet know it, entirely correct. The very next morning, word reached Ashcombe that Lady Constance had called an emergency gathering of her own, a small dinner to be held within the week, to which she had already, without consulting either Alaric or Marianne, extended invitations to a wide circle of the county's most prominent families, including several who had never before shown particular interest in the affairs of Ashcombe Hall. When Alaric rode to Constance's house that afternoon to demand an explanation, he found his cousin composed and entirely unrepentant. "I am simply hosting a dinner, Alaric," she said, pouring tea with steady hands. "There is no law against it." "You know precisely what you are doing," Alaric said, his patience worn thin from the events of the previous evening. "You mean to corner her, Constance. To force the matter before an audience large enough that she cannot simply retreat from the room as she has managed at smaller gatherings. I mean to settle the matter once and for all, for the good of this family's reputation," Constance said, setting down the teapot with a click of finality. "I have learned certain things, Alaric, regarding your wife's true origins, and I believe it is well past time the truth were known, for everyone's sake, including your own." Alaric felt something cold settle in his chest at her words, at the certainty in her voice, so different from the vague suspicions she had traded in until now. "What have you learned?" he demanded. "You will see," Constance said, with a small, satisfied smile that told him she had no intention of revealing her hand before the moment she had chosen. At the dinner, along with everyone else. Alaric left her house with a growing sense of dread he could not quite name, riding back to Ashcombe through fields still touched with the last frost of winter, aware that whatever quiet reckoning he and Marianne had hoped to control on their own terms had now been taken entirely out of their hands, set instead upon a stage of Constance's choosing, before an audience Constance herself had gathered, on a night that was rapidly approaching whether either of them felt ready for it or not. He found Marianne in the garden when he returned, walking slowly along the same gravel path she had favored since their first morning at Ashcombe, her shawl drawn tight against the afternoon chill. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and whatever she read in his face told her at once that the news he carried was not good. "Tell me," she said simply. He told her everything, Constance's composure, her certainty, the strange satisfaction in her voice when she spoke of what she claimed to have learned. Marianne listened without interrupting, her expression growing more still with each detail, until by the end she had gone almost entirely quiet, her gaze fixed somewhere past his shoulder on the gray winter sky. "She has written to the shipping offices," Marianne said finally, not a question but a statement, as though she had already guessed at the shape of what was coming. "She has found the manifest." "You knew this was possible?" Alaric asked. "I feared it," Marianne admitted. "It is why I asked, so long ago, that we keep the details of our marriage as quiet as we could manage. Records exist, Alaric, no matter how carefully we try to keep them from prying eyes. I had hoped we would have more time before anyone thought to look." "Then it is time to tell me," Alaric said gently, taking her hands in his. "Whatever Constance has found, whatever she intends to reveal at her dinner, I would rather hear the truth from you first, in our own home, in our own time, than watch you face it unprepared in a room full of strangers eager to see you stumble." Marianne closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, something in her had settled, some final decision reached after weeks of careful holding back. "Not everything," she said, "not yet, but enough, I think, that you will understand why I have guarded this so closely, and why the choice of when to reveal it must still, in the end, remain mine to make, even now." They walked together back toward the house, and that evening, in the privacy of Alaric's study with the door firmly closed against curious ears, Marianne began, for the first time since their marriage, to speak of the family she had left behind, choosing her words with the same careful precision she had once used to guard her gloved hands from prying eyes. She spoke of a distant homeland, of a lineage that carried both honor and danger in equal measure, of enemies who might yet seek to harm those she loved should her true identity become known too soon or to the wrong ears. She did not tell him everything, not that night, but she told him enough that Alaric finally began to understand the true weight of the promise he had made to her on that foreign shore 2 years before, and why breaking it carelessly now, before she herself was ready, could carry consequences reaching far beyond the gossip of a single English county. "Whatever comes," he said, when she had finished, drawing her gently into his arms, "we will face it together. Constance may have gathered her dinner and her audience, but she does not control the truth itself, only the moment she hopes to force it into the open. If that moment must come now, then let it come on our terms as much as we are able to shape them, not entirely on hers." Marianne rested her head against his shoulder, drawing strength from the steadiness of him, the same steadiness that had first caught her attention on a storm-tossed deck 2 years before. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me enough to wait this long, and for trusting me still, even now that you know there is more beneath the surface than you first imagined. I would wait a lifetime, if you asked it of me," Alaric said. "But I do not think, my love, that we have quite that much time left before Constance's dinner arrives." Outside, the winter evening deepened into full dark, and somewhere beyond the walls of Ashcombe, invitations continued to circulate through the county, carrying Constance's careful, deliberate summons toward every family of consequence within riding distance, each one drawn by the promise of scandal and revelation. Neither host nor guests yet fully understood the true shape of. The night of Lady Constance's dinner arrived with a clear, cold sky. Stars scattered thickly overhead as carriages began rolling up the long drive toward her house, each one carrying guests eager to witness whatever revelation their hostess had promised, though none among them yet knew its precise shape. Marianne dressed carefully that evening, choosing a gown of deep green that Alaric had once told her matched her eyes, drawing her gloves on last of all, smoothing them with steady, deliberate hands even as her heart beat hard against her ribs. She had made her decision the previous night, alone by her window, watching the same stars that now hung over Constance's gathering. Whatever Constance intended to reveal, Marianne would not let it be spoken by another's mouth, twisted by another's ambition. If the truth was to come out tonight, it would come from her own lips, on her own terms, however Constance had hoped to control the moment. "You are certain?" Alaric asked, one final time, as their carriage rolled toward Constance's brightly lit house. "I am certain," Marianne said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. The dinner itself passed in a haze of tension so thick Marianne could feel it pressing against her skin from the moment they arrived. Constance greeted them with icy politeness, seating them prominently at the long table where every guest could watch them clearly, an arrangement Marianne understood immediately for the trap it was. Conversation around the table remained stiffly formal through the meal, though Marianne caught, again and again, glances directed her way, curious and expectant, as though the entire room were waiting for some signal to begin. It came after the final course had been cleared, when Constance rose from her seat at the head of the table, tapping her glass gently to draw the room's attention. "Friends," she said, her voice carrying easily across the hushed dining room, "I know many of you have wondered, as I have, about certain mysteries surrounding our Duke's new marriage. I do not raise this matter to cause pain, only because I believe, as a family who has always valued honesty and proper conduct, that certain questions deserve honest answers, for the good of us all." Alaric's hand found Marianne's beneath the table, gripping it firmly, but Marianne did not look toward him. Her eyes remained fixed on Constance, steady and unflinching. "I have made certain inquiries," Constance continued, "regarding the circumstances of the Duke's marriage abroad. I have learned that the Duchess traveled to meet him not from any family estate, as we were led to believe, but entirely alone, her point of origin recorded in shipping documents as a place unknown to any map or geography familiar to English scholars. I ask you plainly, Your Grace." Her eyes turned finally directly to Marianne. "Who are you, truly, and why have you spent your entire time among us hiding your hands as though ashamed of something the rest of us are not permitted to see?" The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the room turned toward Marianne, dozens of faces waiting, some eager, some merely curious, a few, Hughes among them, quietly supportive from where he sat near the far end of the table. Marianne rose slowly from her chair, drawing herself up to her full height, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly to every corner of the silent room. "You are right to ask, Lady Constance," she said, "and I find I am finally ready to answer, though perhaps not in the way you have hoped." She stepped away from the table, moving to a spot where the candlelight fell brightest, where every guest present could see her clearly. "I was not born to an ordinary family," she began. "My homeland lies far from England, in a place few of you would recognize by name, a small but ancient kingdom whose royal line I was born into, the last surviving child of a family that governed for many generations before mine ended in tragedy. When I was young, my family's rule was overturned by those who sought power through violence rather than right. My parents did not survive that uprising. I did, only because loyal servants smuggled me from the palace before the worst of it reached the royal chambers, carrying me across borders and oceans until I reached safety far from anyone who might recognize my face or know my name. A murmur swept through the room, but Marianne continued, her voice steady despite the weight of every eye upon her. I have spent most of my life since that night hiding who I truly am, moving quietly between distant relations and trusted guardians, always aware that those who seized my homeland might still wish to see the last of the old royal line ended entirely, should my survival ever become widely known. The mark I carry, the one hidden beneath these gloves, is the royal seal of my family, branded into every child of our line at birth, a mark that would identify me instantly to anyone from my homeland who saw it, friend or enemy alike. She reached up, slowly, and began drawing off her right glove, finger by finger, the room holding its collective breath as the fabric slid away to reveal pale skin beneath, and there, on the back of her hand, a mark unlike anything most of those present had ever seen, an intricate design of interlocking shapes, old and clearly deliberate, unmistakably not the mark of any accident or injury, but something formed with purpose and meaning. This is why I have kept my hands covered since arriving in England, Marianne said, holding her bare hand up for the room to see clearly. Not from shame, Lady Constance, but from fear, a fear I carried with me across oceans and years, that revealing this mark before I was certain of my safety, and the safety of those who helped me survive, might bring exactly the kind of danger I had spent my whole life trying to escape. She turned to look directly at Alaric, whose face had gone pale with the weight of understanding finally settling fully upon him, pieces of 2 years' worth of careful half-answers finally falling into place. When Alaric found me on that ship, in the middle of a storm, I was traveling under a different name, toward distant relations who had agreed, at great risk to themselves, to shelter me quietly for the remainder of my life. I never expected to fall in love. I certainly never expected to marry a duke, a man whose position would place me, once again, before the eyes of a watching public, exactly the kind of exposure I had spent my whole life avoiding. But I could not turn away from him, and so I made him a promise instead, and asked one of him in return, that my true identity remain hidden until enough time had passed, and enough distance had grown, that I might finally feel safe enough to claim my own name again. She looked back to the room, to the dozens of faces now watching her with expressions that had shifted, in the span of a few short minutes, from curious suspicion to something closer to stunned respect. I believe that time has come, Marianne said. I am done hiding, Lady Constance. Whatever you hope to gain by exposing what you believed was a shameful secret, I hope instead you have helped me finally set down a burden I have carried for far too long. The room erupted into a wave of murmured conversation, guests turning to one another in astonishment, several rising from their seats for a better look at the mark still visible on Marianne's bare hand. Lady Constance stood frozen at the head of the table, her carefully planned triumph collapsing into something far different than she had intended, her face caught between disbelief and a dawning, horrified recognition that she had badly misjudged the shape of what she had uncovered. "This is absurd," Constance said finally, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "A royal line, from some unknown kingdom? Forgive me, Your Grace, but such claims are easily made, and difficult to prove." "They are not so difficult to prove as you might hope," said a new voice from the doorway of the dining room, and every head turned to see an older man Marianne recognized at once, though the gathered guests did not, standing in traveling clothes still dusted from the road, a leather case held beneath one arm. "Ambassador Rene," Marianne said, her composure nearly breaking for the first time that evening, relief and surprise mingling plainly across her face. "How did you know to come?" "Word reaches even old friends across great distances, Your Highness," the man said, stepping into the room with a respectful bow toward Marianne that drew fresh gasps from the watching guests, the title itself confirming, before any document could, the truth of everything Marianne had just spoken. "I have carried proof of your identity for 2 years now, waiting only for word that you were ready to claim it publicly. It seems tonight, quite unexpectedly, has become that night." He opened the leather case and withdrew a sealed document, old and carefully preserved, bearing an official seal unfamiliar to English eyes, but unmistakably formal in its craftsmanship. "The Royal Registry of Birth for the kingdom's last ruling family," he said, confirming the identity of its sole surviving heir, alongside letters from 3 separate guardians who assisted in her escape, and can attest personally to her lineage, should any further confirmation be required. Alaric rose to stand beside his wife, taking her bare hand in his without hesitation, no longer concerned with gloves or hidden marks or whispered questions, only with the woman standing before him, finally free of the weight she had carried alone for so long. "I believe," Alaric said, turning to address the stunned room, "that this settles the matter Lady Constance so generously arranged this evening to discuss. My wife is not merely the Duchess of Ashcombe. She is the rightful heir to a kingdom that will, I hope, one day welcome her home in peace, should she choose to reclaim what was taken from her family. Until then, she remains under the protection of my name and my house, and I would remind everyone present that any harm that comes to her, from this moment forward, will be answered for directly by me." Lady Constance, for the first time in the entire evening, found herself entirely without words, her careful scheme having produced not the scandal she had hoped for, but a revelation of such magnitude that it left her, and every other guest in the room, utterly reconsidering everything they had believed about the strange, gloved Duchess of Ashcombe. The room broke into fresh commotion as guests rose from their seats, crowding closer for a glimpse of the mark on Marianne's hand, and the sealed documents the ambassador had produced. Mrs. Fenwick, who only weeks before had pressed Marianne with pointed questions on the church steps, now curtsied so low and so suddenly that she nearly lost her balance, murmuring apologies for her earlier forwardness. The young woman who had grasped at Marianne's glove during the Pemberton gathering stood near the back of the room, her face burning with shame, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Hugh Farrow made his way through the crowd to stand beside his old friend, clapping a firm hand on Alaric's shoulder. "I confess," he said quietly, "for Alaric's ears alone, I suspected many things these past weeks, but never once did I imagine this." "Nor did I, in truth, until she began to tell it herself just now," Alaric admitted, watching his wife with an expression of such open pride and tenderness that Hugh found himself looking away, feeling almost as though he were intruding on something private despite the crowded room around them. Edmund, Constance's son, had risen from his seat near his mother, and unlike her stunned, frozen silence, his face showed something closer to quiet relief. He approached Marianne once the ambassador had stepped back, offering a bow more sincere than any courtesy required of him. "Your Highness," he said, "I confess I told my mother from the start that I believed there was nothing shameful behind your silence, only something private you were not yet ready to share. I am glad to find myself proven right, even if the truth is far grander than I imagined." "Thank you, Edmund," Marianne said, and found she meant the warmth in her voice completely. "Your kindness these past weeks, quiet as it was, did not go unnoticed." Constance, meanwhile, had sunk back into her chair at the head of the table. Her earlier triumph curdled into something far less comfortable. Around her, the very guests she had gathered to witness Marianne's humiliation now buzzed instead with admiration and sympathy for the Duchess, casting occasional glances toward their hostess that carried more judgment than any words might have managed. She had built her evening around exposing a scandal, and instead had delivered, entirely by her own hand, one of the most remarkable revelations the county had witnessed in a generation, with herself cast now not as the clever investigator she had imagined, but as the woman who had hounded a grieving, exiled princess for the crime of protecting her own safety. "I did not know," Constance said finally, weakly, to no one in particular, though Marianne heard her clearly enough across the quieting room. "No," Marianne said, turning to face her directly, her voice gentler now than the moment required, though no less firm. "You did not know, but you did not ask to know either, Lady Constance. You assumed the worst, and built your case upon that assumption, without once considering that a woman might have good reason to guard herself so carefully. I do not say this to shame you further before your own guests. I say it only so that you might remember it, the next time curiosity tempts you toward cruelty dressed as concern." Constance had no answer to give, and for the remainder of the evening she said very little at all, watching from the head of her own table as her guests gathered instead around the Duchess she had meant to destroy, offering apologies and well-wishes and no small amount of awed curiosity about the kingdom she had come from and the life she had left behind. It was well past midnight before Alaric and Marianne finally climbed back into their carriage for the ride home, the ambassador having promised to call upon them properly the following day to discuss matters more fully. Marianne sat close against her husband's side, her bare hand still resting in his, neither of them quite ready yet to speak of everything that had happened, the weight of 2 years' silence finally broken in a single evening. "You never once gave any sign," Alaric said softly, as the carriage rolled through the dark countryside toward home, "in all our months together, of carrying something so vast. A kingdom, Marianne. A crown, even, should you choose to claim it." "I did not want it to matter, in the moments we shared," Marianne said. "I wanted you to love the woman on that ship, not the title she had lost. I think, in the end, That is exactly what happened, and I am more grateful for it than I can properly say. I would have loved you regardless, Alaric said, drawing her closer against him. Kingdom or none, gloves or bare hands, that much at least was never in question. Marianne rested her head against his shoulder, watching the dark fields slide past the carriage window, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, entirely and completely unburdened, the mark on her hand no longer a secret to be guarded, but simply a part of herself, finally allowed to see the light. News of the evening at Constance's house spread through the county with a speed that made all the earlier gossip about gloves and secrets seem, in hindsight, like the faintest whisper before a storm. Within days, the story had reached London itself, carried by guests eager to be the first to share what they had witnessed, and within a fortnight it had appeared, in careful and respectful terms, in several of the capital's most read papers, describing the remarkable tale of a foreign princess who had crossed oceans in secret to escape those who sought to end her family's line, only to find safety and love in the arms of an English duke. Ashcombe Hall, once a house of whispered suspicion, became instead a place of curious admiration. Invitations poured in from families who had never before shown particular interest in the Vane household, now eager to make the acquaintance of the Duchess whose story had captured the imagination of the entire county and beyond. Marianne bore the sudden attention with the same steady grace she had carried through the months of quiet suspicion before it, though she found, to her own quiet relief, that this new attention carried a very different weight. Where once she had felt eyes upon her searching for some hidden flaw, now she felt only warmth and genuine curiosity, questions asked freely rather than whispered behind hands. Ambassador Reyna called upon them again 3 days after the revelation, as promised, bringing with him further documents and a proposal that Marianne had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, would eventually arrive, though she had not expected it quite so soon. "Your Highness," he said, seated in the drawing room at Ashcombe with Alaric beside her, "there are those in your homeland, loyal still to your family's memory, who would welcome the chance to see the old line restored, even in some limited capacity. I do not ask you to decide anything today, but I would be remiss in my duties if I did not tell you that the door remains open, should you ever wish to walk through it." Marianne considered this carefully, her hand resting easily now in Alaric's without any covering between them. "I will think on it," she said finally. "For now, I find my life here, at Ashcombe, is exactly where I wish to remain. Perhaps in time, I may find a way to honor my family's memory, without abandoning the life I have built since, but that is a decision I will make with care, not haste." "A wise answer, Your Highness," the ambassador said, with an approving nod. "Your parents, I think, would have been proud to hear it." After he had gone, Marianne sat quietly for a long while, turning his words over. Alaric watched her from across the room, giving her the space to think without pressing for conversation, until finally she looked up and found him watching her with such open love that she could not help but smile. "You are not troubled by any of this?" she asked. "A wife with a kingdom's worth of complications attached to her name?" "I married the woman who pulled me from the edge of a ship during a storm," Alaric said, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair. "Everything else, Marianne, kingdoms and crowns and ambassadors included, is simply the world she happened to come from. It changes nothing about what I feel for you. If anything, it only deepens my admiration, knowing everything you carried alone for so long, and how gracefully you carried it. Not every reaction to the revelation, however, proved so warm. Lady Constance, in the weeks that followed, found herself increasingly isolated from the very social circles she had once commanded so effortlessly. The story of her attempt to publicly humiliate a woman who turned out to be an exiled princess, fleeing genuine danger, did not reflect well upon her, no matter how she attempted to frame her original intentions as concern for family honor. Invitations to her own gatherings grew thinner. Conversations at other houses grew quieter whenever her name arose. She called at Ashcombe unannounced one afternoon, some weeks after the dinner, finding Marianne alone in the garden where Nora the gardener was helping her identify the different varieties of roses beginning to bud with the arrival of spring. "Your Grace," Constance said, her voice lacking its usual sharp confidence. "Your Highness, I should say, though I confess I am still growing accustomed to the correction." "Lady Constance," Marianne said, straightening from the rose bed, her expression carefully neutral. "I did not expect you." "I have come to apologize," Constance said, the words clearly costing her some effort. "My conduct these past months was unkind, born more of my own fears for my son's position than any genuine concern for this family's honor, as I claimed at the time. I judged you before I understood you, and I very nearly caused you real harm through my own ambition. I am sorry for it." Marianne studied her for a long moment, weighing the sincerity of the apology against the months of quiet cruelty that had preceded it. "I appreciate you saying so," she said finally. "I will not pretend the past months were easy ones, Lady Constance, or that your part in them was small. But I have learned, through everything that has happened, that holding on to anger serves very little purpose, beyond weighing down the one who carries it. I accept your apology, and I hope, in time, we might find a way to be something closer to family than adversaries." Constance's eyes, for a rare moment, glistened with something like genuine emotion. "That is more grace than I deserve, Your Highness." "Perhaps," Marianne said, with the faintest smile. "But I find I have rather a lot of grace to spare these days, now that I no longer spend it guarding a secret every waking hour." The two women walked together through the garden for a while longer, an uneasy but genuine peace settling between them, one that would take time to grow into anything resembling true warmth, but which marked, nonetheless, the beginning of something better than the suspicion and scheming that had defined their earlier encounters. Summer arrived at Ashcombe with a warmth that seemed, to Marianne, to carry a different quality than any she had known before, the sun falling freely now across hands no longer hidden beneath fabric, across a life no longer lived in careful concealment. She wrote letters to the guardians who had helped her escape so many years before, sharing news of her marriage and her new life, receiving in return letters of relief and joy from people who had wondered, for years, whether they would ever hear from her safely again. Alaric, for his part, found himself falling more deeply in love with his wife with each passing week, watching her step fully into a life she had once been forced to live only halfway, in shadow and careful silence. He watched her laugh freely at dinner parties, her hands moving expressively as she told stories of her travels, no longer anxious about a slipped glove or a careless question. He watched the county's admiration for her grow into something like genuine affection, invitations arriving now not from curiosity but from real friendship, women who had once whispered about her now counting themselves fortunate to call her a friend. One evening, sitting together on the same garden bench where Marianne had once stood alone on her very first morning at Ashcombe, feeling entirely a stranger in a strange land, Alaric took her bare hand in his and turned it over gently, tracing the mark on the back of it with a careful finger. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. "The years of hiding? The promise you asked of me?" Marianne considered the question seriously, watching the last light of evening settle golden over the grounds of Ashcombe. "I regret the fear," she said finally. "The years of looking over my shoulder, of never quite trusting a room full of strangers. But I do not regret the caution itself. It kept me alive long enough to reach you, Alaric. Long enough to find a life worth finally stepping into fully. I think, in the end, every hidden year led me exactly here, to this garden, to this evening, to you." "Then I am glad for every one of them," Alaric said, "difficult as they must have been, if they led you finally to this moment." They sat together as the sun dropped below the horizon, the great house of Ashcombe rising behind them, no longer a place of whispered mystery but simply home, fully and completely, for both of them. The county that had once watched Marianne with suspicion now spoke her name with respect and affection. Lady Constance, though their friendship remained a work still growing, no longer schemed in shadows but had, in her own quiet way, begun to make amends. And Marianne herself, princess and duchess both, walked now through the world with her hands bare and her head high, carrying no secret heavier than the ordinary, precious weight of a life, finally, fully her own. Word of the remarkable Duchess eventually reached beyond the county entirely, and one bright morning in early summer, a letter arrived at Ashcombe bearing a request from a family of considerable standing in London, asking whether the Duke and Duchess might consider hosting a formal ball, an occasion where society at large could properly celebrate the woman whose story had so captured the public imagination. Alaric brought the letter to Marianne where she sat in the morning room, expecting some hesitation, some lingering reluctance to place herself once more at the center of a crowded room. Instead, she read it through twice and set it down with a small, thoughtful smile. "I think," she said, "I should like that very much. I have spent so long avoiding rooms full of watching eyes. Perhaps it is time I learned to walk into one on my own terms, rather than being pushed into it by someone else's scheming." The ball was planned for the height of summer, and the preparations that followed brought a new kind of energy to Ashcombe Hall, one entirely different from the anxious tension of the months before. Mrs. Aldridge oversaw the polishing of every surface in the great hall with evident pride, no longer merely tending a house under quiet suspicion but preparing it to properly welcome a celebrated princess. Nora filled the gardens with careful cuttings, ensuring that every room would carry the scent of fresh roses on the night of the gathering. Marianne found herself, in the weeks of preparation, growing closer to the household staff in ways she had never quite managed during those first uncertain months. Nora, in particular, became something of a quiet friend. The two women often found together in the early mornings among the roses, Marianne finally free to speak openly of the gardens of her childhood home, describing flowers Nora had never seen and likely never would, listening in turn to Nora's stories of a life spent entirely within the boundaries of the English countryside, each finding something valuable in the other's very different experience of the world. On the night of the ball itself, Ashcombe Hall blazed with candlelight from every window, much as it had on the night of Marianne's arrival nearly a year before, though the mood within could not have been more different. Carriages lined the drive for what seemed an endless procession, guests arriving not with curious suspicion but with genuine excitement to finally meet the Duchess whose story had traveled so far beyond their own county. Marianne stood at the top of the grand staircase beside Alaric, wearing a gown of deep gold that caught the candlelight beautifully, her hands, bare and unashamed, resting lightly on the banister as she looked down at the gathering crowd below. She felt, for the first time since stepping off that carriage so many months before, entirely at ease within these walls, entirely herself. "Are you ready?" Alaric asked quietly, offering his arm. "I have been ready for quite some time now," Marianne said, and together they descended the staircase to greet their guests, the crowd below breaking into warm applause that echoed through the great hall, a welcome entirely unlike the wary silence that had greeted her arrival at Ashcombe so long before. The evening passed in a whirl of dancing and conversation, Marianne moving easily among guests eager to hear her story firsthand, answering questions now not with careful deflection but with open, genuine warmth, sharing pieces of her homeland and her journey that she had once guarded so fiercely. Hugh Farrow claimed a dance early in the evening, spinning her across the floor with the easy familiarity of an old friend. "I confess," he said, as the music carried them through the steps, "I rather miss the mystery of you, Your Highness. Life at Ashcombe has grown considerably less intriguing now that everyone knows your secret. I shall have to find some new mystery to keep you entertained, Colonel Farrow," Marianne said, laughing freely, a sound that had grown far more common in recent months than it had ever been during those first uncertain weeks in England. Even Lady Constance attended, seated at a smaller table near the edge of the room, her presence still somewhat uneasy among the wider gathering, though Edmund remained cheerfully at her side throughout the evening, and Marianne made a point, midway through the night, of crossing the room to invite her personally onto the dance floor for a single dance, a gesture that drew murmurs of surprise from the watching guests but which Marianne offered freely, understanding that true peace required more than a single apology exchanged quietly in a garden. "You did not have to do this," Constance said quietly, as they moved through the steps of the dance together. "No," Marianne agreed, "but I find that grace given freely tends to return to a person many times over, Lady Constance. I would rather build something better between our families than continue carrying the weight of what came before." As the evening drew toward its close and the last guests began making their farewells, Alaric found Marianne standing alone for a moment on the terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens, the sounds of the dwindling celebration still drifting faintly from the hall behind them. "A year ago," she said, as he came to stand beside her, "I stood in a yard not far from here, wondering if I would ever feel as though I belonged within these walls. I did not imagine then that I would one day stand on this terrace, at a ball held in my honor, surrounded by people who have come to know and accept me exactly as I am." "You have always belonged here," Alaric said, drawing her close against the cool night air. "It simply took the world a little time to catch up to what I already knew, from the very first moment you pulled me from the edge of that ship." Marianne turned in his arms to look up at him, the moonlight silver on her face, her bare hand rising to rest against his cheek. No glove between them now, no secret left to guard. "Whatever comes next," she said, "kingdoms or quiet country life, crowns or simple gardens full of roses, I find I no longer fear it, so long as I face it beside you." "Then we shall face all of it together," Alaric said, "for as long as we both shall live." Behind them, the last candles of the ball burned steadily in the great windows of Ashcombe Hall, and beyond the terrace, the gardens Marianne had once walked alone on her very first frightened morning in England, now stretched out peaceful and familiar beneath a sky full of stars, a home finally and completely her own. In the years that followed, the story of the Duke who returned from a long journey with a bride no one had ever seen would be told and retold throughout the county, softened by time into something closer to legend. A tale of love strong enough to withstand suspicion, patience enough to outlast cruelty, and courage enough, when the moment finally came, to remove a glove before an entire watching world, and reveal, at last, the truth that had been worth protecting all along. 2 years after the ball that had welcomed her so fully into English society, Marianne stood once more in the gardens of Ashcombe, though the woman who walked those familiar paths now bore little resemblance to the anxious stranger who had first wandered them alone on a cold morning long before. Much had changed at Ashcombe in the time since. A daughter had been born to Marianne and Alaric that spring, a bright-eyed girl they named Isolde, who even now slept peacefully in the nursery under Nora's occasional watchful eye whenever Marianne needed a quiet hour among her roses. The child's arrival had brought its own quiet joy to the household, Mrs. Aldridge fussing over the nursery with the same devoted care she had once reserved for suspicious glances toward the new Duchess's gloves, a memory that now made the older woman laugh whenever it was mentioned. Ambassador Reina had continued his visits over the years, less frequent now but always welcome, bringing news from Marianne's homeland along with updates on the quiet, careful work being done there by loyalists who had never abandoned hope of one day restoring some measure of the old family's honor. Marianne had, in time, agreed to a modest role in that effort, not as a ruling monarch returning to reclaim a throne, but as a symbol of continuity, a living reminder that her family's line had not ended in tragedy after all. She traveled twice during those 2 years to meet with representatives from her homeland, always returning gladly to Ashcombe and the life she had built there, certain each time that whatever her birthright demanded of her, her true home remained firmly in England, beside her husband and daughter. Lady Constance's relationship with the family had continued its slow, careful mending. She had become, over time, a frequent and welcome guest at Ashcombe, her early sharpness softened considerably by the passing years and by watching, with what appeared to be genuine affection, as young Isolde grew from an infant into a curious, laughing toddler who called her, without any prompting, Aunt Constance, a title Constance had never expected to hold, and had come, quietly, to treasure. Edmund had married the following year, a pleasant, unassuming young woman from a neighboring estate, and the two families now gathered often for dinners that carried none of the old tension, only the easy warmth of people who had, through difficulty, found their way to genuine kinship. Hugh Farrell remained a constant presence in their lives, godfather to young Isolde, a role he had accepted with more open emotion than either Alaric or Marianne had expected from a man usually so composed. He often teased that he had known, from the very moment he watched Alaric fail to explain his marriage properly on that first difficult evening, that something remarkable lay behind it all, though Marianne never quite let him forget that his suspicions at the time had run toward far stranger explanations than the truth had ultimately proven to be. On this particular afternoon, walking the garden paths with Isolde toddling unsteadily beside her, her small hand gripping two of Marianne's fingers for balance, Marianne found herself thinking back often to that first frightened morning at Ashcombe, the weight of secrecy she had carried, the fear that had shadowed nearly every conversation, every glance toward her covered hands. It seemed, now, like a story belonging to someone else entirely, a difficult chapter that had nonetheless led, step by careful step, to exactly this moment, exactly this life. Alaric found them there as the afternoon light began turning gold, scooping Isolde up into his arms as she shrieked with delighted laughter, spinning her once before settling her against his hip. "The gardener tells me the roses along the east wall have finally taken properly," he said, coming to stand beside Marianne, Isolde reaching immediately for a lock of her mother's hair, the same ones your father planted, generations back, before either of us existed to walk these paths. "Nora has cared for them beautifully," Marianne said, smiling as she gently freed her hair from her daughter's determined grip. "I think, in time, this garden has become as much a home to me as any place I have ever known, including the one I was born to." They walked together toward the house as the sun continued its slow descent, Isolde babbling happily between them, pointing at birds and flowers with the boundless wonder of a child who had never known a single day of the fear or secrecy that had once defined her mother's early years in this very place. That evening, after Isolde had been settled into sleep and the house had quieted around them, Alaric and Marianne sat together in the same drawing room, where, 2 years before, he had first pressed her gently for the truth she was not yet ready to give. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting warm light across the room, across the portrait that now hung above the mantel, commissioned the previous year, showing Marianne exactly as she was, hands bare and unguarded, the royal mark on her skin rendered honestly rather than hidden away. "Do you ever think of it," Alaric asked, "that first evening, when you stepped from the carriage in your gloves, and and none of us had any idea what waited beneath them. Often, Marianne admitted, I think of how frightened I was, and how certain I felt that revealing the truth could only bring danger. I think of how wrong I very nearly proved myself, waiting so long, when in the end it was the not knowing that caused far more harm than the truth itself ever could have. Constance would certainly agree with that lesson now, Alaric said with a small smile. She has paid dearly enough for learning it, Marianne said, though her tone carried no bitterness, only the easy acceptance of someone who had long since made peace with the difficult path that had brought her to this quiet, happy evening. I find I am grateful, in strange ways, even for the hardest parts of that first year. They tested us, Alaric, in ways easy years never could have, and we came through it stronger for the testing. Alaric reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, turning it gently in the firelight, tracing the familiar mark on the back of it, no longer a secret but simply a part of the woman he loved, as ordinary now to him as the color of her eyes or the sound of her laughter. Whatever tests still wait for us, he said, kingdoms or quiet country years, further ambassadors at our door, or simply watching our daughter grow beneath these roses, I find I am not afraid of any of it, so long as we continue facing it, exactly as we have from that very first storm at sea. Together, and honestly, with nothing left hidden between us. Together, Marianne agreed, and honestly, I could not ask for a better promise than that. A letter arrived the following week, carried by one of the ambassador's usual messengers, though its contents proved different from the routine updates Marianne had grown accustomed to receiving. The loyalists in her homeland, the letter explained, had made considerable progress in recent months, securing enough support among the surrounding provinces that a formal ceremony was being proposed, one that would recognize Marianne publicly as the rightful heir to her family's line, though without requiring her to take up any permanent rule. It would be, the letter suggested, largely symbolic, a chance for her homeland to properly honor what had been lost, and to formally welcome home the daughter of its last true rulers, even if that daughter's life remained rooted firmly in England. Marianne brought the letter to Alaric that evening, reading it aloud by the fire while Isolde slept soundly upstairs. What do you feel, reading it? Alaric asked, watching her face carefully. Gratitude, Marianne said, after a long moment of consideration. And a strange, quiet sadness, too, for the parents who never lived to see their homeland recover even this much. But mostly gratitude, I think, that something of what was lost might yet be honored properly, rather than simply forgotten. Then we shall go, Alaric said simply. All three of us, if the journey suits a child so young, or you and I alone if it does not, with Isolde left safely here under Mrs. Aldridge's watchful care. Whatever you decide, Marianne, I will stand beside you for it, exactly as I did on that night at Constance's table, and every day since. They traveled the following autumn, the three of them together, Isolde delighting in the long sea voyage nearly as much as her mother once had, though under far calmer skies than the storm that had first brought her parents together. The ceremony itself, held in a modest chapel not far from the ruins of the old palace, was smaller and quieter than either of them had expected, attended by a gathering of loyal families who had waited years, some of them decades, for even this small measure of restored honor. Marianne stood before them in a gown embroidered with the old royal symbols, her hands bare, the mark on her skin visible to every eye in the room without a trace of the fear that had once made her guard it so fiercely. She spoke briefly, thanking the loyalists for their years of quiet faith, honoring the memory of parents she had lost too young to properly remember, and promising, though she would not rule from a throne, to remain always a friend to the people of her birth, a bridge between the country of her heritage and the country she now called home. The applause that followed was quiet but heartfelt, tears visible on more than a few weathered faces among the older guests who had served her family long before her birth. Afterward, walking together through the ruins of the old palace grounds, overgrown now with wildflowers but still bearing traces of the grandeur it had once held, Marianne felt something settle inside her that had never quite found rest before, not even in the safety and happiness she had built at Ashcombe. It was not triumph, exactly, nor was it grief, but something quieter and more complete. A sense of a circle finally closed, a debt finally honored, a past finally, gently laid to rest. Your parents would be proud, Alaric said, watching her survey the ruins with Isolde perched happily on his shoulders, reaching up to touch a low-hanging branch of blossom. Not only for reclaiming what was taken from them, but for the life you built while doing it, for choosing love over fear in the end, even when fear would have been so much easier to hold on to. I did not choose it entirely alone, Marianne said, slipping her hand into his as they walked back toward the waiting carriage. You gave me the safety to finally set the fear down, Alaric, patiently, without ever once forcing my hand before I was ready. That is a debt I do not think I will ever finish repaying you for. Then we are even, Alaric said, for you gave me a reason to come home from that long journey with something far more precious than I ever expected to find, a wife braver than any storm I have weathered, and a daughter who will grow up knowing exactly what courage looks like, should she ever need reminding. They returned to England before winter set in fully, back to the gardens and the roses and the quiet, steady rhythm of life at Ashcombe, carrying with them not a crown or a throne, but something Marianne valued far more deeply: peace, fully earned, and a truth no longer hidden but held instead in the open light, exactly where it belonged. Outside, the stars rose slowly over Ashcombe Hall, over gardens once walked by a frightened stranger and now tended lovingly by a woman entirely at home within its walls, over a house that had learned, through trial and near disaster, exactly what its new duchess had always known to be true from the very beginning: that the truest strength lay not in hiding what one feared the world might judge, but in the courage, when the moment finally arrived, to remove the gloves entirely and stand, at last, fully and completely seen.